You're listening to Silent Crime Stories. Tonight, we step into the shadows once more, into a story that someone somewhere tried to keep buried. Pull up a chair, turn off the lights, and listen closely, because every detail matters. Abakan sits where Siberia stops being a geographic concept and becomes a state of mind. The city was built at the junction of steppe and taiga in the Republic of Khakassia, a place most Russians know little about beyond the fact that it exists somewhere out there. Winters drop to -40°C, summers climb past 30. The climate seems to be constantly reminding people that nature here is never generous, that every day is a negotiation with a landscape that has no interest in human concerns. The city spreads along the Yenisei River and its tributary between the prefab housing blocks of the 1970s and 80s, among which old wooden houses still stand, witnesses to the time when this was just a provincial settlement on the edge of an empire. In 2019, Abakan had 170,000 residents, workers at the metallurgical plant, teachers in schools where children learn in Russian and sometimes in Khakas, bureaucrats in the regional administration, people whose lives moved between apartment blocks and garages, cheap liquor stores and supermarkets stacked with goods from across Russia and occasionally from China. But the story begins earlier. In late summer, August, when the evenings were already growing cool and the sun set a little earlier each day, reminding people that autumn in Siberia arrives without warning, without waiting for the calendar's permission. Young women were making their way home from clubs in the city center, from parties at friends' places, from dates that ended differently each time. Sometimes with a kiss at the gate, sometimes with a slammed door. They walked at night through the empty streets between the blocks, where the streetlights threw weak pools of yellow light and the shadows felt deeper than in other cities, because here, even in summer, the dark carries something of Siberia's mercilessness. Some of them got into cars that stopped at the curb. Friends, strangers, people who offered rides because taxis in Abakan were always expensive and night buses ran rarely, if at all. This was a world where trust and necessity had become the same thing, where a young woman had to decide in a fraction of a second whether the man behind the wheel was safe, or whether she should keep walking, even if home was still 2 kilometers away through a dark housing estate. Nobody knew yet that someone was moving through the city who understood that mechanism of trust completely. Someone who had learned to read the signs, to sense when a woman was tired, had argued with her boyfriend, was slightly drunk, alone inside her own thoughts. Nobody knew that in one of those cars cruising Abakan streets at night sat a man whose imagination had been circling the same image for years. Hands around a throat, a body that stops resisting. The silence that falls when life leaves a person's eyes. That summer, that August, when the sky above Abakan was still bright with stars and the air smelled of steppe grass and petrol from the nearby filling station, something inside the city began to rot, though no one could name it yet. Families locked their doors at night. Mothers told their daughters to come home earlier. But in every provincial city in the world, young people believe that violence happens somewhere else. In Moscow, on television, in films. Not here, in their own city, where everyone knows everyone at least by sight. Only the night streets, the ones between the blocks, already knew that something had changed. That someone had begun to hunt them, methodically, patiently, with the precision of someone who knows exactly what he is looking for. Dmitry Valerievich Lebed was born in 1986 in the final years of the Soviet Union, though nobody knew then how quickly the end would come. His family lived in Abakan, in a typical prefab block where the apartments were small and the walls thin enough to hear the neighbors arguing and strangers' children crying at night. His father drove trucks for a transport company. His mother cleaned at a school. Life moved to the rhythm that Soviet provincial life imposed. Work, home, television, vodka on weekends, a vacation at Lake Baikal once every few years, if they managed to save enough. Dmitry was a child who stood out for nothing. Average work at school, a handful of friends he played football with on the estate pitch, but never the center of anything. More the kind of boy who stood at the edge and watched others laugh and show off. Teachers remembered him as quiet, perhaps too quiet, rarely raising his hand, and when called on, answering softly with a slight hesitation as if every word cost him some effort. At home, nothing happened that would have alarmed neighbors or relatives. The Lebed family was like thousands of others in the city. Not particularly poor, not wealthy, not notably dysfunctional, not exemplary. The father drank, but not more than the other men in the building. The mother kept the apartment clean and made sure her son went to school, though her expectations were modest. She hadn't gone to university herself and didn't believe education could give anyone in this city a better life. Dmitri grew up during the collapse. The Soviet Union disintegrated and Russia entered the 1990s, a decade of chaos, hyperinflation, gangster violence, when old certainties had evaporated and new ones hadn't yet formed. For a young man in Abakan, this meant a world with no clear prospects, where work often didn't pay enough to live decently, where alcohol cost less than food and everyone made do however they could. He finished high school without distinction, then moved between jobs: construction laborer, warehouse worker, mechanic's assistant, where he picked up the basics of car repair. He wasn't a bad worker, but not a remarkable one. Supervisors described him as quiet, someone who followed instructions, didn't cause trouble, though you could never quite tell what he was thinking. His face was the kind that leaves no impression. Medium height, medium build, dark brown hair usually cut short, gray-blue eyes that could look at a person as though they weren't quite seeing them. Women didn't pay him much attention. He tried a few times, a handful of dates that went nowhere because the women felt something in his company they couldn't name. Some coldness, some vacancy that made them not want to see him again. He never mentioned these failures to anyone, never complained, never sought comfort. He simply returned to his apartment where he lived alone after his parents moved to a village outside Abakan, to the old house inherited from his grandparents, where his father could keep chickens and drink in peace without the neighbors complaining. The apartment was kept with a neatness that bordered on obsession. Everything in its place, no clutter, bare white walls, plain furniture, windows covered by blinds that admitted only as much light as necessary to avoid switching on a lamp during the day. Neighbors rarely saw him, and when they did, it was only in the stairwell where he nodded in greeting and disappeared behind his door. No parties, no guests, no loud music. He was like a ghost occupying one of the flats in the block, but taking no part in the life of the building. And perhaps that's why nobody noticed when he began driving through the city at night. Slowly, methodically, along the same streets where young women were walking home from clubs and parties. He had a car, an old Lada he maintained himself, which he cared for more than the apartment, because the car was a tool. It gave him mobility, anonymity, the ability to exist in the city's spaces without drawing attention. Behind the windscreen, he felt safe. From there, he could watch people, and they couldn't really see him, because to someone on the pavement, a man behind glass is just another driver, another face behind a wheel, one of thousands passing through the streets every day. Dmitri began driving regularly at night sometime around 2005 or 2006. No one could establish the exact beginning afterward, but he said himself that for years he'd had fantasies that built slowly, like pressure in a sealed vessel that sooner or later has to give. The fantasies were always the same: a woman who gets into the car, a woman who trusts, a woman who at a certain moment understands she has made a mistake she cannot undo. And in those fantasies, what mattered most wasn't what came afterward. It was that moment when he saw in her eyes the shift from calm to terror, from trust to despair. When he felt life leaving under his hands, resistance fading, the body going still. That was the moment he loved, the one he replayed in his mind for years before he decided to make it real. The first girl disappeared in March 2007, though her family didn't report it for 3 days. At first, they assumed she'd gone to stay with a friend in another city or had argued with her boyfriend and didn't want to pick up the phone. Her name was Tatiana. She was 22, studying education at the university in Abakan, living with her parents in a block on the October estate where several generations of her family had grown up. Her friends described her as cheerful. She liked clubs, dancing, going out. She had plans. She wanted to leave for a bigger city after graduating, maybe Krasnoyarsk, maybe even Moscow, though that was more dream than concrete plan. On the evening of March 13th, she went out to a club in the center with friends. They danced, drank, had a good time, and at around 2 in the morning, Tatiana said she was going home. She was tired. Her friends offered to go with her, but she said no. It wasn't far. She knew the way. She'd be fine. Security cameras at the club caught her leaving. Black jacket, jeans, small bag over her shoulder, walking a little unsteadily but not badly drunk, heading with purpose toward the bus stop. Nobody saw her after that. Not at the bus stop, not on the road home. Not anywhere. Her parents started calling her friends the next afternoon when she hadn't come home and wasn't answering her phone. They told themselves she must have stayed at a girlfriend's place, that she'd probably gone to another party and just forgot to let them know. When the second day passed without a word, her mother went to the police. The officers took the report without urgency. Young woman, 22, left a club at night. She probably met some guy. She'll turn up in a few days. These things happened all the time. Girls ran off to other cities, lost contact with their families, came back eventually as if nothing had happened. But Tatiana didn't come back. Not after a week, not after a month, not ever. Her phone stayed off, her bank account untouched, no traces, no contacts, as if she had dissolved into the air. Police interviewed her friends, the boyfriend she'd been seeing for a while. Everyone said the same thing. No arguments, no problems, no reason to run. The case was logged as a missing person report and left there. One more unresolved case in a city that had many. Tatiana's mother, a woman in her 50s who worked as a cashier at a supermarket, could not accept that her daughter had simply vanished. For months, she walked the city with a photograph, asking strangers if anyone had seen her, putting up flyers on lamp posts and at bus stops and in shop windows. People shook their heads, said they were sorry. Tatiana's father drank more than before because he couldn't bear the thought that his daughter might be suffering somewhere, might still be alive and waiting for help that nobody was coming to bring. The family came apart slowly in the silence that settles in houses when someone is suddenly missing. Someone whose presence was so unremarkable that only its absence makes the walls feel narrower and the air heavier. It wasn't until much later, when other girls began to disappear, that Tatiana's mother understood her daughter had not been alone. The second was Yelena, 20 years old, an economics student who disappeared in July of the same year. She was coming home from a friend's birthday party on the other side of the city. It was late. Around 3 in the morning, the buses had stopped running, so Yelena decided to walk. Over 3 kilometers. Her friends tried to keep her, offered a place to sleep, but she said she had to get back because she had an exam in the morning and still needed to study. The last confirmed sighting of her was on Komsomolskaya Street, walking toward her housing estate. Alone, in a light blouse and shorts because it was warm. The middle of summer. Like Tatiana, Yelena dissolved. A report was filed, friends were interviewed, no leads emerged. Phone off, bank account still. Then there was Natasha, 19, who disappeared in September on her way home from a shift at a grocery store. And Katya, 23, last seen getting into a car at the curb, though the witness who saw her couldn't remember the plates or the make. And Anastasia, 21, who had argued with her boyfriend outside a club, walked away alone and never made it home. All of these women had something in common. They were young, they were alone at night, they were coming home from parties or arguments or late shifts. They were tired, sometimes slightly drunk, sometimes just distracted, and they all vanished without a trace, as if someone had planned it very carefully, had worked out exactly how to take them from the street without leaving anything behind. Abakan police didn't connect the cases for a long time. Each was reported separately in different neighborhoods by different families, and no one thought to treat them as a pattern. In Russian provincial cities, young women going missing isn't rare. Girls leave for bigger cities, fall into drugs, enter sex work, sometimes become victims of domestic violence that nobody reports. The statistics are incomplete. The police are overstretched, and each disappearance is just another number in a register, another folder that ends up in the archive. It wasn't until 2010, when the 6th girl in 3 years went missing, that the mothers began to find each other, to meet, talk, compare circumstances, and realized their daughters were connected by more than bad luck. They started pushing the police, organized protests, gathered signatures demanding an investigation. But the institutions moved slowly and reluctantly because no one wanted to admit that Abakan might have a serial killer. Dmitry Lebed knew exactly what he was looking for. A young woman, alone, who looked tired, who wouldn't hesitate if he offered her a ride. He drove the city streets at night, slowly watching the bus stops, the club exits, the empty pavements. He had a method. He never stopped immediately. First, he'd pass by, check whether she was alone, whether anyone was waiting for her, whether she was looking for a taxi. If she was alone and uncertain, he'd circle back. He'd pull up to the curb, lower the window, ask if she'd like a lift. He spoke calmly, politely, without pressure, with a mild smile, like a genuinely helpful man who sees someone in need and wants to help. Most girls said no. Don't get into strangers' cars. That was the first rule, the one they'd been taught since childhood. But some of them, especially when they were very tired, slightly drunk, had just argued with a boyfriend on a cold night when the temperature had already dropped below freezing. They got in. And then Dmitry knew he'd won the first round. He drove smoothly, made small talk. The weather, work, a friend's gathering he'd just come from. He was pleasant, unobtrusive, didn't ask too many questions, didn't watch them in a way that would trigger alarm. The women relaxed. Some thanked him, said it was very kind of him that he'd saved them a long walk in the cold, and all the while he was watching, waiting for the right moment, for the place he had already chosen. A deserted side street, a car park, behind an old industrial building, a road out of town where there were no cameras and nobody walked at night. When he reached that place and stopped the car, the woman would begin to understand that something was wrong. She'd ask why he'd stopped, why here. This wasn't her address. She wanted to get out. He would turn off the engine, turn toward her, and say he just wanted to talk, just a minute. And when he saw the fear in her eyes, that fear that surfaces when a person suddenly understands that the mistake they've made cannot be undone, something in him broke open, and all the pressure that had been building for weeks, months, poured out at once, and there was no going back. He would attack, strangle, strike, use the physical strength she had not suspected in this calm, ordinary-looking man. She would scream, try to fight back, scratch at him. But he was stronger, had the advantage, had planned everything. When she stopped moving, when the body went limp, he would take it from the car, load it into the boot, drive further out, to one of the wild dumping grounds scattered across the steppe outside Abakan, or into a forest, where he would dig a shallow hole and bury her, covering everything with branches, rubbish, whatever was at hand. He wasn't a perfectionist. He didn't particularly care whether the body was found. He knew that in such places nobody searched, that the police lacked the resources to comb dozens of square kilometers of steppe and forest, that bodies could lie there for years before someone stumbled across them by accident. He would drive home, shower, put his clothes in the washing machine, clean the car, wipe everything down. Then he'd go to sleep. In the morning he got up, went to work, made conversation with his colleagues, functioned normally. And the next night he drove out again. This went on for 10 years, from 2007 to 2017, during which he killed at least 19 women, though he said there were more, that he couldn't remember all of them, that some had blurred together in his memory because killing had become routine, something he did when the need arose, when the fantasies grew too strong to hold back. He didn't experience it as murder in any moral sense. It was the satisfaction of a need, one that felt to him as natural as hunger or thirst. He didn't think about the victims' families, about the devastation he was leaving behind. He saw only his own world, where he was in control and the women were objects that existed to meet his requirements. In Abakan, an informal group of mothers had formed. Women who had lost daughters who met in a cafe on Lenin Street, talked, cried, shared information the police wouldn't give them. They came from different backgrounds. Some were teachers, others cleaners, cashiers, nurses. But they shared the same grief, The same emptiness that settles in the chest when a child disappears, and you don't know whether she's alive or not, whether she's suffering or already gone. Tatiana's mother, whose daughter had been the first, became their unofficial leader. She organized the meetings, walked into prosecutors' offices and local newspaper newsrooms and television studios, demanding that someone finally treat these cases as a whole rather than as a series of separate disappearances. She remembered every detail of the last evening with Tatiana. How her daughter dressed to go out, put on red lipstick, said she'd be home in a few hours. It wouldn't be late. She remembered waiting the next day, growing increasingly worried, calling friends, trying to reach her daughter's phone, which was off. She remembered going to the police and the officer taking the report without interest, saying it was normal, that young girls sometimes disappeared, that she'd probably come back. And she remembered how the days passed and Tatiana didn't come back, and how the hope that had been strong at the beginning slowly went out, replaced by a cold certainty that her daughter was no longer alive, that something terrible had happened, something that couldn't be undone. Yelena's mother remembers waking in the night for months after the disappearance, listening for footsteps on the staircase, believing that maybe Yelena would come back after all, would open the door and say it had all been a mistake. She'd been away for a while, but she was home now. The footsteps were always neighbors returning from night shifts or drunks looking for their own door. And every morning, waking in the empty apartment, she knew another day would pass without answers, without a body, without the chance to bury her daughter properly and say goodbye as she deserved. In the Orthodox tradition, burial is a sacred obligation. The body must be put in the earth, the family must gather, say the prayers, light the candles. Without a body, there is no closure, only endless waiting that eats at you from the inside. The mothers organized demonstrations outside the prosecutor's office, carrying photographs of their daughters and signs that read, "Find our children." Who killed our daughters? Abakan cannot be a city of fear. The local papers ran short items. Local television showed brief clips. Nothing moved. The prosecutor's office maintained it was investigating, but that evidence was insufficient to link the cases, that perhaps the girls had left of their own accord. The mothers heard those arguments dozens of times until they stopped believing that anyone truly wanted to find the killer. They felt abandoned by the state, by the institutions that were supposed to protect them, as if their daughters hadn't been important enough to spend time and resources on. In that atmosphere of helplessness and grief, 10 years passed. While Dmitry Lebed killed in silence, invisible, untraceable, like a shadow moving through the night city and leaving behind only absence. In September 2017, something changed. A young woman named Alina was walking home from a bar shift late at night when a car pulled up beside her. Dmitry Lebed, as usual, offered a ride. Alina was tired. It was autumn. The air was cold. She still had over a kilometer to go. So she got in. She gave him her address and he began to drive. But something in his voice, in the way he glanced at her, unsettled her. Maybe she was more alert than the others. Maybe she had better instincts, or maybe this particular evening was already stressful and every detail seemed worth scrutinizing. When she noticed he wasn't heading toward her street, she asked where he was going. He tried to reassure her. "A shortcut. We'll be there soon." Alina didn't believe him. She grabbed the door handle, pushed it open, and jumped from the moving car. She hit the asphalt, scraped her palms and knees, got up fast, and ran toward the nearest apartment block, screaming. Dmitry Lebed could have gone after her, could have tried to stop her. But he saw lights coming on in windows, realized someone might have seen, and drove away fast. Alina ran to the nearest door and knocked. A resident let her in. The police were called. And this time, the police responded. Because there was a witness, a survivor, someone who could describe the attacker, the car, the circumstances. Alina gave a description. A man around 30, average height, short dark hair, driving an old dark blue Lada. Officers began canvassing the area, asking whether anyone knew someone matching the description, anyone with that kind of car. Dmitry Lebed lived in the same neighborhood. One neighbor remembered he had that kind of car. Another recalled that he often drove at night, even though officially he worked day shifts. Police knocked on his door, asked if he'd answer a few questions. He agreed, let them in, answered calmly. Yes, he had that car, but he'd been home that evening, hadn't given anyone a ride. The officers had no hard evidence. Alina had seen him only briefly and wasn't certain it was him. But one of the more experienced investigators felt something was wrong. Something in the way Dmitri talked, in his absolute calm, in the total absence of any emotion. They asked him to come to the station for a supplementary interview to help them rule him out as a suspect. He agreed because he knew refusing would look worse. At the station, they asked about his background, his work, his acquaintances, what he'd been doing the previous few evenings. He answered steadily without losing composure. Then the investigators showed him photographs, Tatiana, Yelena, Natasha, and the others. And Dmitri, perhaps tired, perhaps caught off guard by the realization that the police had connected the cases, made a small mistake. He hesitated for just a second, looked at one of the photographs a beat too long, as if he recognized the face. The investigators saw it. They pressed harder. Did he know her? Had he ever seen her? He denied it, but they had something to work with now. They asked for consent to search his apartment and car. He could have refused, but he knew that would implicate him further. He agreed. The apartment was clean. Too clean, but nothing incriminating. In the car, however, beneath the seat, they found a lock of hair that didn't belong to him. DNA analysis matched it to one of the missing women, Katya, who had disappeared 4 years earlier. That was the break. The investigators knew they had their man. They arrested him immediately, charged him with kidnapping and murder. Dmitri denied everything at first. A mistake. Those hairs could have gotten there some other way. But the interrogations ran for days, the evidence accumulated, and one by one the denials became harder to maintain. After several days of intensive questioning, Dmitri Lebed began to talk. Not out of remorse, not because he wanted to unburden himself. He simply concluded that further denial was pointless, that the evidence was sufficient to convict him. So he started explaining, slowly, without emotion, how many women he had killed, how he had done it, where the bodies were. He described it in the tone of someone walking through a technical procedure, a series of steps in a process he had carried out many times. The investigators listened in silence, taking notes. Then they drove with him to the locations he named. The steppe outside the city, forests, illegal dumping grounds. And there, in the ground, they found remains. Bones, fragments of clothing, small personal objects that had once belonged to the missing women. Each find confirmed what the mothers had known for years, that their daughters were gone, that they had been murdered, that they were never coming back. The trial of Dmitri Lebed opened in 2019 at the district court in Abakan, in a small room that quickly filled with journalists, victims' families, and onlookers. He sat in the defendant's cage in a prison jumpsuit, calm, detached, as if the proceedings didn't concern him personally. He was charged with 19 murders, though he himself said there might be more, that he couldn't remember all of them, that some had blurred together. The prosecution presented the evidence: DNA analysis, Alina's testimony, forensic reports from the burial sites, recordings of his interrogations in which he described his methods. The defense challenged certain pieces of evidence and argued that a confession made under pressure wasn't reliable. But nobody in the courtroom doubted the man in the cage was guilty. The mothers of the victims sat in the front rows. They had come to see him in person, to look at the face of the man who had killed their daughters. Some wept quietly. Others stared with expressions that had moved past grief into something colder, as if all the suffering had crystallized into a still, hard fury. Tatiana's mother was given the opportunity to address the court. She stood and said that for 12 years she had lived in uncertainty in hope that maybe her daughter was somewhere alive, that maybe she'd come back. Now that the remains had been found, now that she knew how Tatiana had died, she felt that her world had ended, that nothing made sense anymore. and that all she wanted was for Dmitry Lebed to receive the harshest possible sentence, so that he could never again harm anyone. Dmitry listened without any visible reaction, eyes on the floor, as if he were somewhere else in his mind. When asked in court why he had done it, what he felt when he killed, he answered flatly, "Satisfaction." It met a need. He didn't think of the victims as people, only as objects. Psychologists who evaluated him before trial determined he had pronounced psychopathic features: no empathy, no remorse, a capacity for manipulation, an ability to rationalize his actions. He was found legally sane and fully capable of bearing criminal responsibility, which meant the defense couldn't argue insanity. The trial ran for several months. Dozens of witnesses testified. Hundreds of pages of documents were submitted. In February 2020, the court announced its verdict. Dmitry Valerievich Lebed was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 19 counts of murder. When the judge finished reading, the courtroom went quiet. The families knew this wouldn't bring relief, that their daughters wouldn't come back, that the emptiness would remain. But there was something, some closing, some confirmation that justice had been reached, that Dmitry Lebed would never be free again. He received the verdict without reaction, nodded slightly as if he had expected it all along. He was taken from the room to a maximum security penal colony somewhere deeper in Siberia, where he will spend the rest of his life in a cell, cut off from the world with no prospect of return. Abakan after the trial was a changed city, and an unchanged one. People began to talk openly about what had happened, about the fact that for 10 years a killer had lived among them, walked the same streets, shopped at the same stores, and nobody recognized him. Nobody suspected. Debates broke out about why the police hadn't connected the cases sooner, why the victims' mothers had to fight on their own for anyone to pay attention, why the system had failed. Some blamed the local authorities for negligence. Others said it was simply impossible to prevent such crimes, that psychopaths can hide even from those closest to them. But regardless of the explanations, something fundamental had been broken. The trust that residents had placed in their city, in its safety, in the idea that violence like this happened somewhere else. Not here. Not among us. Young women in Abakan became more cautious. They stopped getting into strangers' cars, walked in groups at night, called home when they were on their way. But the fear that had grown during the years Dmitry Lebed was free didn't disappear with the verdict. Fear embeds itself in a city's tissue and stays there for a long time. In the stories mothers tell their daughters, in the warnings repeated at every departure from home. The mothers founded an association to help families of missing persons, organizing meetings, providing psychological support, lobbying authorities to improve search procedures so that every disappearance would be taken seriously, so that the situation would never again arise in which girls vanished for years while no one connected the dots. Tatiana's mother became the face of the movement. She appeared in the media, told her story, reminded people that behind every statistic, behind every case number, there was a specific person, a specific family, a specific grief. And though she knew none of it would bring her daughter back, she felt she had to keep doing it. To give Tatiana's death some meaning, to make sure the girl's life wasn't just a line in a police register. At the places where the remains were found, families placed crosses, lit candles, brought flowers. A forest outside the city, where Dmitry had buried several of his victims, became a place of remembrance. Every year, on the anniversary of his arrest, families gather there. A priest leads a service. They stand in silence. The forest, once indifferent, became part of the city's history, a place that holds what happened, that will not let it be forgotten. Dmitry Valerievich Lebed is held in one of Russia's strictest penal colonies, spending 23 hours a day in a cell, without contact with other inmates, without work, without recreation. Prison staff describe him as quiet, compliant, someone who follows instructions, but who never initiates any relationship, never speaks to anyone beyond what is strictly necessary. He lives inside his own head, in a world he has built there where there is no room for reflection, for guilt, for any attempt to understand what he did. Psychologists who have conducted sessions with him in prison say he shows no signs of wanting to change, that he doesn't understand why his actions were wrong, that in his own mind, killing was simply the fulfillment of natural desire. Therapy was attempted, but he answered questions mechanically, as if completing an assignment he had to finish in order to earn some small privilege. He doesn't believe in God, doesn't seek absolution, isn't troubled by what comes after death. For him, there is only now, the cell, the four walls, and the memories he replays when there's nothing else to do. His parents stopped visiting after the first year. His mother tried to come a few times to speak to him through the glass, but she couldn't bear the equanimity with which he described his crimes, the complete absence of regret. His father never came. He said he no longer had a son. They live now in the village outside Abakan, rarely speaking with neighbors because the shame they carry is unbearable. The shame of having raised this person, of not having seen what was forming inside him. But somewhere beneath that shame is the knowledge, half admitted, half buried, that Dmitri had always been different, that something had broken in him long before they had any way of understanding what it was. He will be in prison until he dies. Russia has no death penalty, so life means life. He will age there, grow sick, die slowly without hope of release. When it comes, nobody will grieve. His family will not claim the body. He will be buried in the prison cemetery in an unmarked grave alongside other inmates whom no one wishes to remember. Their photographs hang now in the office of the association the mothers founded. Tatiana, Yelena, Natasha, Katya, Anastasia, and 14 others whose names were read aloud at the trial, whose remains were recovered from the earth, whose lives were cut short before they had the chance to really live them. In the photographs, they are young, smiling, full of expectation. One taken at graduation, another on a summer holiday by a lake, a third at a friend's birthday party. These are photographs from the time before they knew what fate was preparing for them, when they believed the whole of life was still ahead. University, work, love, children, old age. And in those photographs is the full weight of their deaths, not in how they died, but in everything they never got to live. When people in Abakan talk about Dmitri Lebed today, you hear different things. Some say he's a monster, that life imprisonment isn't enough, that he should suffer the way his victims suffered. Others say he was a sick man, that psychopathy is an illness that went untreated, that if the mental health system had worked better, if there had been programs to identify serious disturbance in young people, perhaps it could have been prevented. Others say there's no point searching for explanations. Some people are simply evil, they do evil things, and the only thing you can do is stop them once you finally catch them. The truth is probably somewhere in between, in that gray zone where biology, psychology, society, and chance intersect. Dmitri Lebed was born with certain predispositions, grew up in an environment that gave him no tools to manage them, lived in a society that couldn't recognize what he was before it was too late. And before anyone understood he existed, he had left behind 19 destroyed families, 19 empty places at tables, 19 women who never saw the future they had dreamed of. Abakan is a city that carries this history now. And though life goes on, though new generations grow up in its schools without any memory of the years when Dmitri Lebed hunted the night streets, the memory of what happened remains. In the warnings mothers give their daughters, in the crosses at the forest's edge, in the meetings of the association, in the quiet awareness that evil doesn't always come from outside. Sometimes it lives next door, behind a wall, and waits for its moment. And in the silence that falls over the city each evening, when the streets empty and the lights come on in the apartment windows, there is still an echo of those years. The echo of footsteps of women walking home who never arrived, the echo of a car pulling up to a curb, the echo of a last cry that no one heard. That echo will remain in Abakan's collective memory, indelible, like a scar that won't heal, like a wound that makes itself felt every time someone asks, "Did this really happen here, in our city, among us?" And the answer is always the same. Yes, it happened. We cannot change it. We can only remember and refuse to let the silence around disappearances last so long again. Refuse to let a cry for help go ignored. Refuse to make mothers fight alone for the truth. That is the lesson Abakan paid for at the highest possible price. 19 young lives that had the right to a future, and received instead a grave in the ground and a place in the statistics. As long as those faces hang on the walls, as long as the mothers light candles at the forest's edge, the story of Dmitry Lebed and his victims will not die, as a warning, as a memory, as a quiet cry that carries over the city each night when the darkness comes. That's all for tonight. But before you leave this darkness, take a moment. Every story you heard here really happened. Somewhere there are people who remember, who still can't sleep at night, who are still searching for answers. Crime is never just a story. It's someone's life that went terribly wrong, or was taken by someone who thought they would get away with it. And sometimes they do. But silence has a way of speaking. Eventually. If this story made you feel something, leave a comment. Just one word. One sign that you were here, that you listened, that you remember. Because that's what Silent Crime Stories is all about.